Hi, Anna's sister here with I Dig Dead People. Got another episode here. This one's going to deal with some historical context, placing your family in the history of wherever they lived, make their story even more interesting, but also talking about how to do some research when you've got family lines that are repeating the same first names, and it's just really hard to figure out if you got the right people or not. So sometimes when we're researching a family and we get pretty far back, we start running into families that have like generations of people with that same first name, and it just makes it so hard to trace the generations. And the further I've gone back on some lines, I've had trouble like with a missing generation because there was a person who just didn't leave any kind of like historical record behind indicating they even existed. So I've run into this several times, and it requires some really in-depth research to make sure the right person is identified in each generation. So I start with a family history with Camille Houston Long. She was born March 27th, 1901 in Sussex County, Delaware, and she died August 26, 1962, also in Sussex County, Delaware. Sussex County, Delaware is one of 3 counties in that state, and it's the most southern county. Camille's parents were easily identified as William C. Long and Mary Alice Hudson, and they married November 15, 1873 in Sussex County, Delaware. Now, to keep them in historical context, they were married, about 10 years after the end of the Civil War. So that just gives you an idea of where to place them in the time period. My purpose with this family was to follow the Long family back as far as I could. And so then I started looking at this William C. Long. He was born May 1852 in Sussex County, Delaware, and died October 22nd, 1904, also in the same place. His parents were William M. Long and Hester Lewis, and they married July 5th, 1841 in Dagsboro, Sussex County, Delaware, so still in the same area. And again, historically, they're getting married before the Civil War, so another generation back. This was an example of that I was talking about, of the father and son having the same first name, William, and trying to make sure we had the right people. It's relatively easy to validate that William C. was William M.'s son because they both appear in the 1860 U.S. Census together. William, the son, was 9 years old in the 1860 census, and he's listed with his parents, William and Hester. Additionally, he also shows up in the 1870 census with William and Hester. So there were no other William Longs of this age in the same area. So this was enough evidence for me that we had the right William with his parents. And unfortunately, the earlier censuses before 1850, they don't list all the family members. So this starts to make it harder to identify child-parent relationships when you start getting further back. And this did happen as I was researching this line. So we're researching William M. Long. He was born about 1817 in Sussex County, Delaware, and he died about 1880 in the same place. He's actually buried near a tree along Whitesville Road in Sussex County, Delaware. And I know that's kind of strange, but it's come up in other research, and I actually visited the spot. And there are several gravestones there, but I was unable to read the stones. They're just not legible. However, other genealogists who have researched decades ago and where I got some of this information from, they were able to read the stones and confirmed that William and his wife Hester were buried there. So to put William M.'s life in historical context, he was born 5 years after the War of 1812 with Great Britain, very beginning of the nation's history, and he died 15 years after the Civil War ended. So he would have seen quite a bit of stuff in his life while he was living in Delaware. So finding William M. Long's father was a bit harder, and it required a process of elimination looking at other documents. And I was able to narrow it down to Jesse Long. Jesse Long was born about 1775 in the same area, Dagsboro 100, Sussex County, Delaware, and he died around 1840 in this area as well. So Jesse Long's one of those people I talked about who did not leave many records behind. He is found in the 1810, 1820, and 1830 U.S. Census records. However, like I said, these records don't list other family members. They just list the head of household, and then they make a notation like this many children, male children of a certain age, and this many female of a certain age living in the household. So it's a little harder to confirm those parent-child relationships with those records. So the 1810 census was not helpful in determining whether William was Jesse's son, because William wasn't born yet. However, the 1820 and 1830 U.S. censuses show that Jesse had a son William's age. And I can then continue to look at other Longs in the area on the census records. And I was able to, with a process of elimination, determine that Jesse must be William's father, because the other Longs in the area either didn't have a son William's age showing up on the census record, or I had already determined that they were part of a different side of the family and not of the line I was researching. Now, finding Jesse's parents, that was even more difficult. I suspected that Jesse's father was a David Long, who lived in Sussex County, Delaware. Previous research over the years had shown this, but dates of birth and death didn't add up when I was looking at other people's research. Some people just had wild differences in dates, and I don't mean just a couple years, I mean like generations different. So it wasn't adding up when I was looking at their research. I was finally able to determine that David Lange Jr. was Jesse's father, and his grandfather was David Lange Sr. So there were two Davids. There was two generations of Davids in a row. The only way I was able to determine this was through probate and will records. So Jesse's father, David Lange Jr., was born January 12, 1742 in Dagsboro Hundred, Sussex County, Delaware. His birth record, actually his baptism record, is recorded in St. Martin's Church, and his siblings and his parents are also listed in this record. His parents were David Long and Anne Lockwood. I was also able to find David Lange Jr.'s probate records, which listed Jesse Long as the administrator on his estate. This was a find. I mean, I had been searching for years trying to find a connection between Jesse Long and David Lange Jr. I had suspected it all along, but I hadn't found any actual documents to link them until I was doing some research and wrote to the archives in Delaware and asked if there was any probate records for either Jesse or David Lange Jr. And voila, I get some stuff in the mail, and there is a probate record for David Lange Jr. And on the front of it, it says that the administrator of his estate was Jesse Long. So being an administrator on the estate, usually that was a son's job. So when a man would pass away, his son would administer his estate. So this really was an awesome find to be able to connect those two together as father and son. This was the only record I could find that showed a relationship between David Lange Jr. and Jesse Long. Census records weren't helpful because Jesse was born long before the first U.S. Census in 1790. I mean, he was an adult by that time, so he was a head of a household. I wasn't able to place him in a family with a father, a head of household. So once I determined that there were two generations of David Longs, one was Jesse's father and the other his grandfather, it was easy to prove that relationship between the two Davids. As I stated earlier, Jesse's father, David Lange Jr., was born in Dagsboro Hundred, Delaware in 1742. And I knew that from a birth record at St. Martin's Church. That church is in Worcester County, Maryland. So it's just over like the Delaware-Maryland line. It would have been the closest church for the family to go to. And I've actually visited this church. I've been able to walk through the same building. It's a great little church. And just being able to be in a building of the people that you're researching, walking through the same building, sitting in the same pews, like it's just amazing to be able to do that. So I just love when I can find a historical building associated with a family. So David Lange Jr. died sometime around 1815 because that's when his estate was probated by his son. And he's buried in the Long Family Cemetery in Frankfort, Sussex County, Delaware. And I've been able to visit that cemetery as well. It's off on a country road, back in some trees, And there's several Long family members there, including some of David Lange Jr.'s siblings. So that's just, again, another great find. David Lange Jr.'s father was David Lange Sr., and he married Anne Lockwood. David Lange Sr. was born sometime around 1707 in Queen Anne's County, Maryland. He married Anne Lockwood May 20th, 1735 at that St. Martin's Church in Worcester County, Maryland that I talked about. So Queen Anne's County, where he was born, is actually on Eastern Shore, Maryland, and it's west of the Delaware border. And where he got married is actually a bit south of that, about some southeast of that. So at some point he made that move. So I say he died probably around 1791 because that was the year his will was probated, and his will lists several children, including David Lange Jr., which is awesome because that's just cementing that relationship for me. I definitely knew those two were father and son. So keep in mind that during the last years of David Lange Sr.'s life, there was a lot going on in the United States. The country was just a fledgling nation, and they were recovering from the Revolutionary War, which had ended in 1783, and he died in 1791. From 1776 through 1787, the country was operating rather badly under the Articles of Confederation. I don't know if a lot of Americans know this, but we did not have a constitution right away when we were the United States. We ran under an Articles of Confederation, which did not have a strong central government, and that was problematic for the young country. So 4 years before David Lange Sr.'s death, the U.S. Constitution was approved by the Continental Congress and went into effect 10 months later. So research on this line has taken me to the beginning of American history, which is just fascinating for me. So finding David Lange Sr.'s parents, that was hard as well. I had to rely on some previous research that was conducted by a Cecil Eugene Lange that I had found online. This research has possibly opened up 3 more generations on this line. David Lange Sr.'s father was probably John Lange Sr., born around 1670 and died February 16, 1747. At the time of his death, he owned land in what is now known as Queen Anne's County, Maryland, which is where we found that David Lange Sr. was born. This area is on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and for those who don't know what that is, when I say that, Eastern Shore, Maryland, there's a peninsula that comes down below New Jersey, and you got the Chesapeake Bay on the western side, Atlantic Ocean on the eastern side. That peninsula consists of parts of Maryland, which we call Eastern Shore, Maryland, all of Delaware, and then in the south, a bit of Virginia. So they call this the Delmarva Peninsula. So we're talking about John Lange Sr. He never saw the American Revolution. He lived as a British colonist his entire life when he was in Maryland. And at the time of his death, the country comprised just like 13 colonies, just those 13 colonies. Everyone lived east of the Appalachian Mountains, and much of the land was wilderness inhabited by Native Americans. In fact, like hardly anyone lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. The British government actually had a law in effect that land west of the Appalachians was to be for the Native Americans, and all British colonists were supposed to stay east of that landmark. That didn't always happen. This John Lange's father was David Lange. So here we go with those repeating names again. We've gone from 2 Davids in a row to a John Lange, and now we're on to another David Lange. This David Lange lived from 1640 to 1697. It's suspected that he was born in Virginia, and he's listed as an early settler of Eastern Shore, Maryland, coming to that area in 1677. He would have been about 37 years old when he settled on the peninsula. Eastern Shore, Maryland was actually first settled in 1631, and it was considered part of the Virginia colony. Eventually became its own colony of Maryland. In 1642, Kent County was formed in Eastern Shore, Maryland, and then by 1706, Queen Anne's County was formed from parts of Kent County. And that's the area we're talking about that these Langes were from. So by the time this David Long settled on Eastern Shore, Maryland, there were only 4 British colonies. We only had Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maryland. The Swedes had settled in parts of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware as well. But for British colonies, that was it right now. That's all that was there. So you're talking vast wilderness, Native Americans inhabiting the land, and, a few settlers in 4 different colonies. So the father of this David Long was another John Long. So now we're repeating another name again. This John Long was born probably around 1615 and probably in England. I say this because he's been found on a passenger list in 1635 with his wife traveling to Barbados from London. He traveled with several people that he paid passage for. Not all of them were family members. However, because they all traveled together, they were probably settling an area together. So a few months after they arrive in Barbados, many of these people he traveled with are seen on another passenger list going to Virginia. We don't see John on there, so it's possible he was on another ship and went earlier, and then these people were joining him later. The Virginia colony was established in 1607, and it had a really rough start. The first settlement was Jamestown, and the only goal they had when they came to Jamestown and established it was to find gold. So as a result, no food was planted, and all their time was spent trying to find gold. So in addition to this, you've got a powerful Native American tribe confederacy, several tribes together, called the Powhatan Confederacy. And they were very strong and lived on this land where these English settlers, colonists are coming to look for gold. So if you're only looking for gold and you're not planting any food, you're going to get hungry. And that's what happened. These people were starting to starve. Ships bearing food and supplies, they didn't come to relieve this settlement for 2 years. And so by the time the ships got there 2 years later with supplies in 1609, only 80% of the original settlers, I say only 80% of the settlers had died, and only 20% were still alive. So these 80% had succumbed to starvation and disease. Those that had survived, the 20% that had survived, most of them had to resort to cannibalism to survive. So this was just an awful start for a colony. It's the same time period that we hear the story of Pocahontas, and it's also during this time period that relations with the Native American tribes, with this Powhatan Confederacy, they were tense at best over the next couple of decades. The Native Americans were not happy that the English settlers were there, and of course the English settlers would fight back when they were attacked. So our earliest John Long that we're talking about arrived in 1635 at this Virginia colony. During this time, in 1635, relations with the native tribes were still tense. About 10 years after his arrival, there were coordinated attacks on the colonists by these native tribes. And this is the scene that John's son David would be born into, this constant tense atmosphere of not knowing the next time there's going to be an attack by the Native Americans. Additionally, there was a rebellion in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, occurred in this colony as well. This was a rebellion against the British governor. It failed. However, it added to the atmosphere of what was occurring in this colony. We're not only fighting Native Americans now, we're fighting each other. And not enough food, starving. The land is not the greatest for farming anyway. It's just a really rough time. In addition, if John Long had several sons, his younger sons would have had to find a way to fend for themselves once they reached adulthood. English law said that anything you owned went to the oldest son, and your younger sons had to figure something out. So these waves of violence occurring in the Virginia colony, not great land, and possibly being a second or younger son maybe what prompted David Long to move north and settle on Eastern Shore, Maryland, just to gain his own land and definitely a better farming place. So these early 3 generations, they're going to require quite a bit more research to really determine if they are indeed the correct line. This is going to require finding some documents like wills, deeds, probate records, passenger lists to differentiate between the different Davids and the different Johns in this particular line. What's most interesting to me with these early lines is how they fit into our country's history. I mean, these 3 early generations lived really adventurous and dangerous lives. I mean, they settled new colonies that were in conflict with native tribes. They were establishing homes and farms out of the wilderness. I mean, that is hard work. And then they're building a new nation after rebelling against Great Britain and getting independence. So there is just a lot of stuff going on during the time period of these 3 early generations. So placing our ancestors in historical context, that's what really makes the research so exciting. So if you enjoyed this episode of I Dig Dead People, be sure to click the like button and ring the bell so that you receive notifications of our next episode. And I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for watching. This is Anna Sester from I Dig Dead People.